All right, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you had a wonderful lunch. You got to hear about all of the fabulous things that are happening during lunch, get to meet some of our superstars and some of the superstars at your table right now. I am actually going to be standing right here at the podium because this session is webcast. So if you've been in my sessions before, I tend to, if I have the liberty, I tend to walk around in circles. So being up here tied to the podium will keep me in one place. So I'm a little bit far away from you guys, I feel like, but anyway, we'll make it work. So thank you very much for coming this afternoon. So this session is entitled A Perfect Pairing, the National Standards for Quality Online Courses and the QM K-12 Rubric. My name is Christine Voelker. I am the K-12 Program Director for Quality Matters. The past maybe, I don't know, 3 years of my life, 2.5 years of my life, I have spent in one way or another working in depth with either the national standards or the QM K-12 rubric. And I have been working very in depth with a lot of you here in this room. So thank you for coming out to support me today, and I'm glad to have you here. Okay, so I wanted to start off with this little ditty. Let's see if it goes. Looks like it's, okay.
My chocolate is in my peanut butter.
Great taste.
It's doggone good.
You get two great tastes in one candy bar. Reese's Peanut Butter Cup. Real milk chocolate. Delicious peanut butter. Two great tastes that taste great together. Reese's or Reese's Crunchy. Topped with chopped peanuts.
I don't think they make that Reese's Crunchy anymore. Okay, so I wanted to bring that video up because if you remember that video, it's like those two things smashing into one another. And when I think about the national standards and the QM K-12 rubric, in my head went through a lot of things when we were first getting started, and one thing was smashing them up. And I'll revisit that in a little bit, but I want to first give you a little bit of a background about how this all came about. I forgot I have to stand here. So how this all came about. So many of you may be familiar with the INACOL standards for quality online learning. So they had 3 standard sets, the National Standards for Quality Online Teaching, the National Standards for Quality Online Courses, and the National Standards for Quality Online Programs. The National Standards for Quality Online Teaching and the National Standards for Quality Online Courses have not been revised prior to this revision since 2011. And the National Standards for Quality Online Programs haven't been revised since 2009. So while they've stood the test of time, people were getting antsy and people were starting to say, hey, when are these standards going to be revised? And INACOL, knowing this and knowing what their community wanted, was very understanding. And while their priorities have started to shift and change, they decided that no longer could they really keep revising these standards. And so they approached Quality Matters because they knew Quality Matters background with standards development, with standards revisions. And since we've worked with them in the past, and they were very familiar with that. They also approached, at the same time, they approached the VLLA, the Virtual Learning Leadership Alliance. And the Virtual Learning Leadership Alliance, they approached them because they have a really great background working with online programs, boots on the ground, you know, teaching online courses. And so this ended up being a great partnership for us, for both of us, for both of our organizations. So the Virtual Learning Leadership Alliance is a nonprofit, just like QM. And they are an organization made up of 15 statewide virtual schools. And so they work together on a lot of different projects, one of them being working through, Quality Matters stuff. So they are all Quality Matters members. We've worked together in the past, and so this just made sense. And so we ended up partnering together to revise these standards. And so this process didn't happen overnight. It took a long time for us to kind of flesh out how it was going to all work, how we were going to make it happen, what were the steps involved, who were we going to involve. And so one of the first tasks that we did was to create a leadership team. And we were very mindful to make sure that that leadership team had not only people who had worked on the INACOL standards in the past, because we wanted to keep that historical perspective, but also people who, who were really leaders in the field. And so we set up a base camp. We had monthly meetings. Actually, we had bi-monthly meetings at first. And so we really worked hard to figure out, how are we going to provide oversight for this revision process, and how are we going to see it through? And so this leadership team, I can't say enough about the hard work that they put in to see these standards come to fruition. And they are members from all different types of organizations, not only from QM and the VLLA, but from all over. So we're really happy to have them. And the leadership team, we figured out a couple of guiding lines that we needed to go by. And one was that each set needed to complement one another, because when we were looking at the INACOL standards, we found that there was a lot of overlap. And so we really were mindful about making them complement one another. We wanted to include explanations and examples if they weren't there before. We wanted them to be research supported. We wanted them to have a consistent look and feel, not only amongst their covers, but the inside as well. And we wanted to include huge community involvement, and we wanted them to be openly licensed. And so that set our stage. And so what we have are a set of national standards that are research supported because of their guidance, and the people who helped out with these standards, they're research supported. They're flexible to meet each unique institution's situation and need. They're continuously revised. That's our hope, that we're going to keep continuously revising these standards to keep them up to date. That's our promise. Revised and updated by online learning researchers and practitioners, and recommended for use in development, evaluation, and continuous improvement. So throughout this revision process, overall, through all the different standard sets, because we worked on them at different times, we had 116 organizations participate. 9 different types of organizations, all from non-governmental organizations, for-profits, nonprofits, statewide virtual schools, little districts who maybe had a couple of online learning courses. So we really wanted to get a whole bunch of perspectives. And so I think in doing this process, we were able to do that. And those people came from 32 states and overall 3 countries. So there was a lot of buy-in and a lot of community engagement, and a lot of people who were really invested in these standards, who wanted to really see them revised well. And these are people who have used those INACOL standards for years and years and years. And so in doing these standards, we also had to take that into consideration and make sure that we stayed true to the legacy of those standards while bringing a new, fresh perspective to them. So you can see the breakdown of the different standard sets and who worked on them up there on the screen. The largest one was from the teaching standards, and secondly was from the courses. So there were just tons of people, and some people who worked on 2 different standard sets. If you're in this room and you worked on the standard set, raise your hand. Woohoo! All right. So there's even more of a breakdown to the people who worked on these standards because there was different legs that we had to accomplish in order to get place to place. And there were survey respondents, we had the leadership team involved, we had work group members, we had reviewers and contributors. And those contributors worked specifically on making the changes to those standards, and they were anywhere from reviewers to teachers to instructional designers to directors to administrators. So we really did try to get all of those different perspectives from the different roles as well as the different types of organizations. So the revision process as it went through, the first thing that we did was put out a survey to the K-12 online community as a whole. And we said, we want you to take a look, and we did this for each standard set. We said, we want you to take a look at the standard set. We know you have opinions about them. We know you know what you want to see change, so let us know so that we can, work that in and look and see if that's indeed something that's going to, work for our community. And so we put out a survey, and the results from that survey was then passed along to our contributors who worked in teams. And this process really very, very closely followed the QM rubric revision process, because look who was overseeing it. So me. So anyway, we very closely followed that process. So you'll see we did a literature review. So here's our literature review. All of these resources can be found not only on the QM website, but also on nsqol.org. That is our National Standards for Online Learning website. And that's a joint website between the VLLA and QM. So we did literature reviews for each of the standard sets, for the teaching standards and the program standards, and also for the course standards. And the one that we did for the course standard also served to help with the revisions for the K-12 rubric. And then we had project managers. We had two people who oversaw each of the different standard sets, and they were chairs. And then we had work group team leads, and then we had work group members. So you'll see in that other slide, I showed you how many people. So really, when we did the QM rubric revisions, we had 3 people work on each general standard. On these, the community involvement was so huge that we had from 10 to 12 people on each different area of those specific standard sets. And notice I called them areas because they weren't really called standards then. So we had to come up with that nomenclature. So the revision process, from the contributors, we found that what worked best was if we paired a practitioner with a researcher. And so in doing this, we found that when the work groups were led by one person who was a researcher and one person who was boots on the ground, a teacher, involved in online learning in their organization, it really worked the best. And so when we did the course revisions, we made a mindful decision to make sure that each standard was led by those 2 roles. So that was really tremendous and helpful to us. The revision process worked much like it works with the QM revision process. So each team got together on their own. They looked over the different indicators that were there, and then they proposed their revisions. For each proposed revisions, they had to go through and make sure that they were measurable, specific, and valid. And then they had to put their considerations, why they proposed that revision, and also come up with explanations and examples. And so you'll see there the revision rationale. The current standard had too many elements that actually meant the same thing. And so they also put in their supporting research there of what was going to support that standard revision. So what we did after that revision happened, and I'm going through this really quick because it actually took many months. And so once that happened, we sent it out to another subset of the community who who wanted to just review the standards and look at them for, you know, consistency, to make sure that they were measurable, to make sure that they were specific, that they were valid, that they had complete explanations, relevant examples, and specific examples. So they went through and they looked through each of these. Once they looked through them and provided their feedback, we had this all on a giant, tremendous spreadsheet. When that was on a giant, tremendous spreadsheet, then we went through that and we wove that feedback from the reviewers and worked with the work groups again to revise those, and then worked it into how it is today. So a huge community effort. And so what you see here are the 3 national standard sets, the national standards for quality online teaching, for quality online programs, for quality online courses. The first 2 sets that we did were the teaching standards and the program standards. So we did those first intentionally. And one of the reasons was because the program standards hadn't been revised since 2009. They were sorely in need of revision. And so we chose, and they were never revised. That was actually this was their first revision. And so we chose to do the program standards. We also chose to do the teaching standards and hold off on the course standards. Because even though the course standards, I would say, was probably the most popular set of INACOL standards, those standards, we decided to hold those off until we were ready to revise the K-12 rubric and do them at the same time for a reason, and I'll get into that in a minute. So I'll run through this really quick, and I'm gonna make sure I'm watching my time. So notable changes to the teaching standards specifically. Originally, in the last set of teaching standards, there were teacher knowledge and understanding, and then teacher abilities. Those we then determined that we wanted to call all of them indicators. And so so now we have a standard, which is equivalent to the general standard in QM. And then we had indicators, which is equivalent in QM talk to a specific review standard. So the indicators are under the standards. For the teaching standards, 2 standards were removed, 2 standards were reworked, 2 standards were combined, and those are standards, not indicators. So those are the big chunks. And then 8 new indicators were introduced and an overall reduction of 20 indicators. So we went from 72 indicators in the old teaching standards down to 52, to a much, I think, more manageable set. And we really streamlined because a lot of those were overlapped into, like I said, the program standards or the course standards. So we really tried to make it its own set and to reference those other standard sets where we could, so that, you know, people could then, you know, use them all interchangeably. So then we ended up with 8 standards for online teaching, and those were professional responsibility, digital pedagogy, community building, learner engagement, digital citizenship, diverse instruction, assessment and measurement, and then instructional design. And we put instructional design on there as kind of like an, I don't want to say optional, but optional standard. And the reason is because we know not all of our teachers in all of our districts across the world have access to develop their own courses or to even change their courses. And so that had to be optional for us. And so that one is on there. Then the standards themselves, we labeled them as standard A, B, C, D, E. And then we also labeled them numerically. So D4, the online teacher establishes relationships through timely and encouraging communication using various formats. You'll notice there on the screen that there are examples and explanations up there. So what we wanted to do, because not all the standard sets had this, was to include this in there to make sure that there was, you know, a little bit of explanation to further flesh out what that indicator was, and then also examples, so that, you know, how would this look like in practice? And these are just that, just examples. So there's how they looked, and then we followed this through with all of the other standard sets. So you'll notice the program standards, the course standards, those all look just like that with the explanations and examples. I did mention that we have the NSQOL website. The NSQOL website has a bunch of different things that you can do on there. So that's where the standards can be downloaded. We do have PDFs of the standard sets on the site, and you can also go on there and just, you know, pull up each standard itself, and you can view them right there on the site. We also have lots and lots of resources. The literature reviews are up there. The change documents for each and every standard set, so where they changed, and for some of them, you know, there were some bigger changes because they weren't revised in so long. So you'll see all of the change documents up there, and then also for some of them you'll see like alignments between the other standard sets and alignment to the QM standards. So that's all up there. There's also a place where you can become a supporter of the standards. So that's a great place for you to become an individual supporter, or you can support the standards. Your organization can support the standards. And that's just a little form that you fill out, and I say okay, and it goes right on the website. And there's also a place where you can contact us for more information and be a part of these standards revisions as we move forward. So we're always looking for more and more involvement, and I keep a master list of everyone who wants to be involved in the next ones. So the program standards, that was the next one that we released, and we did those at the same time. So we did have a lot of people working on this huge initiative. So the program standards actually had a rating scale in there that we removed, so that each organization can use that, you know, how they needed to. Because we know there's so many different organizations using these standards, and they had to be flexible enough to fit those different organizations. So, you know, if you're a supplemental online learning program, you're gonna need different, you know, standards there than you would if you were maybe a full-time learning organization. So we really wanted to keep that in mind and make sure that these were flexible enough. And so we removed the rating scale. 2 standards were removed, 2 standards were reworked, 2 standards were combined, 3 new indicators were introduced, and there was an overall reduction in the number of standards and indicators, another pretty large reduction there in the number of standards and indicators that were reduced. So we had 14 standards then identified for quality online programs, and you can see them up there on the screen. So they're chunked out into different standard areas, and again, there's indicators underneath them, just like I showed you for the teaching standards. So we did it pretty much the same way. And I did want to mention that in our CRMS at QM, we will be putting the teaching standards in there so that you'll have access to those standards within our CRMS tools, so you can use them, as well as in the self-review tool. So that's a neat little thing. That's a neat little thing for you to know about. So I'm just waiting for the last minute testing to be done on that, and then I'll be able to upload those. So that'll be cool. Okay, so the revision process. So I wanted to go through, and I talked about the program standards, and I talked about the teaching standards. The last standard set that we needed to tackle were those course standards. Now, the whole time we were doing the teaching standards and the program standards, you know, it was really great. We were all working together, but little did you know that inside my mind, I was like, oh, how am I gonna make this work? How am I gonna do this in tandem with the QM rubric? And how am I gonna make this work seamlessly with the QM rubric? And how are we going to communicate that to people? So a whole bunch of different things going through my mind. So here it is, we finished up the program standards, we finished up the teaching standards. All of you guys who were contributing on those standards, you all said, huh, I'm done with that, I'll go back to my, you know, crazy life at work. So you're going back to that, and I'm thinking, okay, maybe you're all sitting by the fire with your feet up, but that was not me. Here was me. Instead, I was looking like this, like, oh my gosh, this is coming up soon. We needed to get those groups together. And so the holidays were coming up. Right before the holidays was when we were starting to get the contributors together for the National Standards for Quality Online Courses, and also getting a group together to revise the QM rubric. So I'm like, okay, at this point I'm thinking, you know, I really should get this under control and know how this is all gonna work. So I did, you know, I figured it out. And so I said, okay, so we have these two rubrics to do at the same time. One was the K-12 secondary rubric and the publisher rubric. Those both needed to be revised. And then, so that's the QM side. And then there were the national standards for quality online courses. So how are we going to do that? Well, here we are back to making them work together.
Peanut butter.
Chocolate.
Peanut butter.
Chocolate. Peanut butter on my chocolate.
You got chocolate.
Peanut butter on my chocolate.
You got chocolate in my peanut butter.
Two great tastes that taste great together.
Bravissimo.
Two great tastes that taste great together. Reese's Peanut Butter Cup. Real milk chocolate. Good old-fashioned peanut butter.
I thought about Reese's peanut butter cups and I said, okay, how can we smash these two things together? So here I am, like spinning around, landed upside down on my head, and finally I got it. All right, so we're gonna take the QM rubric and smash it together with the INICOL standards. So what did we do? Well, remember these two things are happening at the same time. So the QM rubric revision, we always had a team of 12. So we kept true to that. We had our nominations. We selected a phenomenal team. And it was all volunteer. So this was volunteer. They were nominated, and they were teams of 3 for each standard. At the same time, there were gobs of people who wanted to work on the national standards for quality online courses. So we had over 50 people who were working on those national standard courses, national standards for online courses. That was all volunteer as well. But we had teams of about 10 for each standard, 10 to 12, I would say, on each of those. And now those were going to be openly licensed. So that poses another problem, right? How does that work in tandem with Quality Matters? So I'll tell you first about the changes that we made to the course standards. And actually, before I do that, I wanted to mention that one of the things that we did consciously was to make sure that there were at least a few people on each of these 2 revisions who were working on the revisions, so that we had that constant communication. We knew what was going on in the national standards. We knew what was going on in the QM rubric. Because, again, we wanted to make them be able to work together, and we wanted to make them work together seamlessly. And for that, we couldn't work siloed. We needed to work together. And so that's just what we did. So the national standards for quality online courses, 2 standards were actually added to this standard set. 8 new indicators were introduced and 6 indicators were removed. The old INICOL standards, the 2011, this is the 2nd edition of those, and that had 5 sections in there. So content, instructional design, student assessment, technology, course evaluation, and support. We ended up, when we were done, with 7 standards. So we changed them. We changed them from calling them sections to calling them standards, and then under each one were indicators just like the other standard sets. So course overview and support. Sounds a little familiar, right? That was the first standard that we introduced. That was new. And then content, instructional design, learner assessment, accessibility and usability. That was another new one. Technology, and then course evaluation. Remember I said there were a lot of die-hard INICOL course standard users out there. And so they are these standards are very important to them. So we really needed to keep that in mind when we revised these standards. And there are people who, you know, are really fans of the QM rubric. We needed to keep that in mind. So we really needed to preserve both of those standard sets while making them connect. So the course standards, again, technology was one standard set. This actually, the accessibility standard that we introduced came from this technology standard. So we pulled this out. There was one technology standard in the old INICOL standards, the one accessibility standard, and that was D10. Everybody knows about standard D10. Standard D10 was now pulled out, and we made a standard E, accessibility and usability. So standard E really mirrors exactly the QM standards. So we took the accessibility standards because those made the most sense to our community, and we use them for the national standards as well. So section E, course evaluation and support. So that ended up being standard G. And then standard A was a new one that we introduced, course overview and support. There were things within the INACOL standards that made more sense to be pulled out and put in that course overview and support area. And so that's what we did. The old INACOL presentation, they had some columns there. They had reviewer considerations, and they had to what extent of the course does it meet the criteria. So they had a list of criteria, and they had those reviewer considerations. So we switched it up. We changed it so that it looked like all the rest of the standard sets with explanations and examples. Okay, so where do these fit together? At the same time, again, remember we were working on the QM standards. What you'll notice here, though, is that in the course review standards, there's explanations and examples, but there's only, a few sentences. So where QM fits into this whole process is that if you look at the QM rubric, it's a lot more robust there. And so this is where we're going to find all of the details, all of the information for reviewers so that they know exactly when they're reviewing a course, how to go about doing it. None of that is in the national standards. While there are explanations, while there are examples, this is a lot more fleshed out. And so that's what you'll find within the QM K-12 rubric. Is the national standards only more robust? So those are in there. And while they don't mirror one another exactly, they're very, very extremely close. And we do have an alignment up on the NSQOL website and also on the QM website and also on your tables that shows where they correlate. So we had done that in the past with the QM rubric and the old INACOL standards. But if you notice up there on the screen, it wasn't a one-to-one correlation. It was more like a one-to-many. And so while we were able to derive a report from the QM standards to make it fit within the INACOL standards, it was really like taking a bunch of different standards because maybe 3 of them fit within the QM rubric, or 3 of the QM standards fit within the INACOL standards. So we had to figure out, how to get that done. Now, when you look at the alignment document, it's more of a one-to-one representation. And so you'll notice they're very, very strongly correlated now. And that's because those teams work together. And we were very careful to try and make them as closely aligned as possible. So you'll notice on that alignment, you'll see that some of the standards there are maybe exactly the same. So up here, some of the standards and indicators. So up here, you'll see like A2, minimum computer skills and digital literacy skills expected of the learner are clearly stated. That actually correlates with 1.4T. And so in the QM rubric, you'll see it as 1.4T. Minimum computer skills and digital literacy skills expected of the learner are clearly stated. That is exactly the same right there. Is exactly the same. You'll notice that in A2, there is an asterisk next to that indicator. That's because that's exactly the same as the QM standard. Okay, so when you see that asterisk, that's why it's there. If you see the asterisk in any of the explanations and examples, it's because those explanations and examples were pulled right from the QM rubric. Okay, so that's where that comes out to be. So now when you see the correlation, it's very much more of a one-to-one. So how do these work together? Just like I said, so we have the national standards, and then we have the QM rubric, which fleshes it out even more, gives more best practices, more examples, more direction for reviewers, more direction for how do you use this in an elementary course? How do you use this in a blended course? So you'll see a lot more of that in the QM standards. We also do a derived NSQ report, much like our derived INACOL standards report. So you'll see that if you still need the standards in the national standards format, we can do a QM review. A lot of our publishers do this. So we'll do a QM review, and then because they need it in the national standards format, for example, in some of their states, in order to be used in that state, we'll derive a report so that they can generate that report. Now the report does link them back to the QM standards, so it'll say, see the feedback from standard 1.1T. So it'll link them back and show them exactly where that feedback is for more information. But it'll tell them if it was met, partially met, or not rated, because that was the old rating scale in the INACOL standards. So really it'll kind of end up looking like this. So you see there at the bottom, it says, for feedback, refer to QM review standards 2.1, 2.2, 2.4. And this is from the last version, so 2.5 is still in there. I know some of you are catching that as you're sitting there. Okay, so official certification. So when you go through a QM review is actually so aligned with the national standards, so we're really the official certification for the national standards. So when you do that, you're actually saying, okay, we're certifying that course. So that actually will stand up and hold for both of those. Okay, so I got through that in just enough time, I think, right, Jim? All right, so last thing I want you to do is think about how these two standard sets work together. And you have some things on your table. You have some stickers that you can take home with you. You have some Reese's cups. You have the national standards themselves. You have the correlation document. And you have the change document for the course standards. But I want you with your table to think about how you would talk about how these two standard sets have collided the same way as a Reese's cup has collided with the chocolate and the peanut butter. So I want you to think about how you would introduce the collision between these two standard sets, share a goal for their use, and then tell us why they're better together. So those three things are there at the bottom: introduce the collision, share a goal for their use, and tell us why they're better together. Now, for you folks at home, we do have a Flipgrid set up. So if you want to do this and play along at home, you can create your little commercial and upload it to a Flipgrid, and that is right there. That URL is there on the screen. But for those of you who are sitting in your groups right now, I want you to talk about how you could make that into a commercial. Go. So in your commercial, you're going to introduce the collision between the two standard sets. You're going to share a goal for their use, and then tell us why they're better together. I did this activity just for Jolene. You can also eat those peanut butter cups now. Try and wrap up your commercial in 1 minute. Thank you. All right, so Kirsten, did your table come up with something really great? All right, let's hear it. Oh, okay, great. Okay, so they put theirs in the Flipgrid so we can watch it later. Did anyone else come up with something, a different idea? Oh, I guess I could. I don't know if, oh. I have to get rid of this thing. I don't, oh wait, wait, sorry. Let's see, did it load? Nope, not yet. It'll get there, but we'll have this so that we can revisit it. Anyone else have an idea? I couldn't hear you, sorry. Anybody else have an idea of how they would explain this like a Reese's Cup commercial? Okay, Christy.
Standards are like the plain tortilla chips on the bottom, and that the QM rubric was very much like all the goodies that you put on top that make them the nachos that we all love and enjoy.
Awesome.
And the sports bar does a fantastic job, so if you're hungry later, the pulled pork, the pulled pork version was fantastic.
All right. Well, very good. I think that kind of leads us to not too much time for questions, right, Jim? Any questions? Jeff.
Thank you for shepherding this process. This was very, very much needed and very much appreciated.
Thank you for being a part of it. I mean, you guys are phenomenal throughout this whole thing. So really, all the thanks goes to all the people involved. We couldn't have done it without the support of all of your organizations, for every one of you who took any little part in it, from doing the survey to at the beginning, which was kind of small compared to the survey at the end for the reviewers. So any little thing that you did to help out, we really appreciate it, and so does our community, because it only helps our students. So I want to thank you again for coming. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, tweet at me, all of that good stuff, and support the standards, and let us know if you want to be involved next time if you weren't this time. Thank you.